We've seen so far in our study of regeneration that regeneration is necessary, that it is mysterious, and that it is the beginning of the Christian life. Now, as we looked at Paul's letter to the Ephesians, we saw that the accent is upon what God does for us in regeneration. In fact, sometimes we refer to regeneration as the divine initiative. It is the activity that God undertakes to intervene in our lives and change us from a state of spiritual death to a state of spiritual life. The Old Testament describes our condition this way, that we by nature have a heart of stone. And that heart of stone must become a heart of flesh. Now that's a little strange, isn't it? Because when Jesus talks about being spiritually reborn, he's distinguishing between the flesh and the spirit. He says that which is born of the flesh is the flesh, and it needs to become spiritually alive. And the Old Testament speaks about the difference between stone and flesh, between that which is lifeless and that which is pulsating, vibrant, healthy, and in motion. And that's what takes place through the divine initiative. Now, I'd like to just take a minute here before we go to another New Testament text to put a couple of words up on the board that are not everyday theological terms that are part of our normal Christian jargon. And so we're going to need some concentration here. I want to put the word monergism and the word synergism. Sort of sounds like some kind of esoteric disease, don't they? Monergism, the prefix mon, does not stand for money, Kurt. The word mon, by way of a prefix, indicates what? One. Something that is single. All right? And the word erg, everybody knows what erg means. Everybody knows what an erg is because everybody in this room who went through the first 8 grades of elementary school in America learned at one time the definition of an erg. That's right, an erg is something that lives under a bridge next to a troll. No, an erg is a unit of labor or a unit of work. And we get the word energy, from this root. So if we put it all together, this fancy word is just really made up of some very basic elementary parts. Monergism means literally one working, or it indicates something that is a monergistic work is one whereby only one party is performing the task. Let me say it again. A work that is monergistic is a work where only a single party is doing the task. Synergism, the prefix syn means with, together with, and so that a synergistic work is a work where 2 or more people are working together to bring a task to completion. And so a synergistic work is a cooperative work. Now, what we're saying here is that rebirth is a monergistic work, not a synergistic work. That it is done by God and by God alone. As I mentioned in our last session, a dead man can't cooperate with his resurrection. Jesus didn't go in there to the tomb of Lazarus and say, Lazarus, let's discuss this. And I need you to help me overcome the dreadful implications of your recent demise. That's not how he talked to Lazarus. Lazarus was helpless and hopeless because he was dead. So that the work that is done in bringing a person from spiritual death to spiritual life is something that only God can do. Now, after he changes that heart of stone, and after he brings us alive, then are we involved? We must believe, we must repent, we must seek after the things of God. But the point is, we won't do that because we can't do those things until first the initiative is accomplished by God, whereby God changes the disposition of our heart, quickens our souls, so that now we respond by embracing Christ and fleeing to Him and repenting and so on and doing all these things. But again, the point is the initiative is by God. Salvation, ladies and gentlemen, is of the Lord. And if you've recently become a Christian and you're trying to understand what has happened to you, I think it's vitally important that you understand that point early in your Christian development so that you have the proper appreciation for God's grace and a proper spirit of gratitude established at the very beginning of your walk with God. All right, so that we see then this monergistic work and that regeneration refers to the divine initiative, and that I'm going to put this formula on the board. Regeneration precedes faith. Regeneration precedes faith. If regeneration is the beginning, if it's the first step, then obviously it comes before the second step. It's not like dead people have faith, and because they have faith, God agrees to regenerate them. But rather, faith is the fruit of this action that God performs in our hearts. While you were dead in sin and trespasses, Paul says in Ephesians, you were quickened. While you were still dead. All of this, I'm saying, to come to our consideration for this day. And that is that even though regeneration is necessary, regeneration is mysterious, regeneration is a beginning, regeneration is a result of a sovereign work of God. That when God works in you to bring you to life, it is a work of sovereignty. That is to say that God exercises His power and His authority over you to bring about the desired result of changing your heart. The reason I say that is for this reason, that there are many people who understand regeneration as simply an activity of moral suasion, where God remains external to us and seeks to woo us or entice us and persuade us to change and to come in His direction. But what I'm suggesting to you, following the thinking of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas and the great giants of the Christian faith, is that regeneration is not just God standing apart from you, trying to persuade you to turn around and come to Him, but God comes inside of you. He invades your soul. Because there has to be a substantive change made in that heart for you ever to come to Christ. For you ever to desire the things of God, you have to be brought alive. And to be brought alive requires a sovereign act of God. Now, I'd like to turn your attention in this session to the book of Acts, to the 9th chapter, to perhaps the most famous record of a conversion that we find anywhere in the history of the church. And of course, it is the conversion of the Apostle Paul. Now, you know that the New Testament teaches, for example, that not many wise and not many great were called of God as part of the initial foundation for the primitive Christian church. But for the most part, the early church was made up of the oppressed, of the poor, of the exploited, of those of limited means. And that this was part of the plan of God, not to choose the powerful and the rich and the famous in order to establish his church. But it's not that the scriptures say that there were none taken from the level of leadership positions or sophisticated levels of status and the like. It just said, not many, but there was one. And his name was Saul of Tarsus, who was from a family of merchants and who had received an exceedingly extraordinary higher education. It's been maintained by certain experts of the person and the work of the Apostle Paul that had Paul never been converted, had he never been visited by Christ on the road to Damascus and subsequently changed from what he was to what he became, had he been left alone by the Almighty to pursue his course that he was on prior to his conversion, that in all probability the modern world would still be cognizant of this man. Because it has been said of the Apostle Paul that in the first instance, he was probably the most educated Jew in Palestine of the first century. He was the star pupil of Gamaliel, who was the leading rabbi in Jerusalem, and Paul had the equivalent of what would be 2 PhDs by the time that he was 21 years old. And as a young man, he had risen in a meteoric rise to a position of political and theological ecclesiastical authority in the nation. Now, not only was he a learned man and a competent man, but he was also a highly passionate man. He was a zealot. He talks on one occasion describing himself as a Pharisee of Pharisees. Do you remember that? Now, we're not exactly sure of that, of what that means. But we know that the phrase Pharisee of Pharisees, just like a King of Kings and Lord of Lords, that construction is a use of the superlative in the Hebrew language. When you say that a man is a man of men, you're saying he's not just an ordinary man, he's not just a better man, but now we move into the third level of the superlative of the best. He is in a class by himself. He's in the highest possible level. Now, there is one tradition that survives from the early church that suggests that among the Jews of antiquity, there were the Pharisees who were devoted to the keeping of the law, but even among the Pharisees, there was an inner core of Pharisees who held the belief that if any one of them would keep the 1,001 laws that they were dedicated to, if any one of those group would keep all 1,001 laws for one day perfectly, that act of virtue would provoke God to send the Messiah. So that there's this handful of zealots among the Pharisees, who practiced all kinds of self-denial and asceticism and all the rest. They were devout in their studies, and they were scrupulous to every detail to try and keep the law perfectly for just 24 hours. And they believed that if they could do that, that would bring the Messiah. And the one conjecture is that when Paul calls himself a Pharisee of the Pharisees, that he was this kind of borderline fanatic or zealot for the law of God. Notice how he enters into the foolish response to his critics in the book of 2 Corinthians when people are laying charges at Paul, and Saul says, he says, you people making foolish charges, you want me to answer like a fool? I'll be a fool. He says, are they Jews? So am I. Are they for? So am I. You know, I've done this, I've done that. And he says, if anybody was a zealot for the law, Paul was.